Chapter 11. Robert Zarinsky, a serial killer nabbed by DNA. There are some people among us who should never walk the streets free. These men, and sometimes women, are career criminals who do untold amounts of damage to society for sometimes long periods of time before they are usually sent to prison, only to be released one day so that they can return to the streets and prey on more victims. For every crime that these predators get caught committing, there are several more that they get away with, often including murder. Robert Zarinsky was one such career criminal and predator. When he was not incarcerated in a prison, juvenile hall, or a mental hospital, he was on the streets victimizing the people of New Jersey. Eventually, Zarinsky was convicted of murder, but the parole system and sentencing guidelines meant that he could conceivably be released one day to prey on more innocent people. If Zarinsky could prove to a parole board that he was either reformed or no longer a threat to society, then he could be released. Thanks to modern science, Zarinsky's DNA profile made sure that he would never hurt anyone again. A predator from the beginning. Robert Zarinsky was born in 1940 to a middle-class New Jersey family, although the family's income level was about the only thing that was middle American about the extremely dysfunctional family. Robert showed signs of extreme violence and cruelty at a young age that are often the hallmarks of a future serial killer. He was known to torture animals and often beat his sister Judith, to which their mother, Veronica, told her son, "Don't hit her in the face." Yes, the matriarch of the Zarinsky household doted on and enabled little Robert, which led the future serial killer to commit innumerable antisocial acts. He was never punished for anything he did and was even allowed to victimize his own father. According to those close to the Zarinsky family, Robert routinely dished out physical beatings to the father, Julius, and often took his earnings from the family store that he owned. Zarinsky clearly received no direction in his childhood, which no doubt contributed to his criminal behavior, but there seemed to be something deeper in the man that set him apart from the average misguided individual. Robert Zarinsky enjoyed being cruel. As Zarinsky became a teenager, he learned new ways to inflict pain and misery on others. He gathered together a number of like-minded losers and formed a gang he called the Panthers. The Panthers employed Nazi imagery, even though Zarinsky's father was Jewish, and enjoyed terrorizing the residents around Linden, New Jersey, with acts of arson and vandalism. Zarinsky's reign of terror culminated at the age of 22 when he and his friends burned down 5 lumber yards and desecrated hundreds of tombstones in a Jewish cemetery. Robert claimed insanity and spent some time in a mental hospital. Zarinsky was not cured. In fact, after Robert was released from the mental hospital, he traveled around New Jersey, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. A life of murder and a life in prison. While most of the people in the United States were adjusting to the great social changes of the 1960s, Robert Zarinsky was apparently killing women throughout the state of New Jersey. The change in culture from the somewhat rigid rule structure of the 1950s to the permissive attitudes of the 1960s seemed to be the perfect backdrop for Zarinsky's murderous obsession with girls and young women. Unfortunately, the science needed to catch Zarinsky and other serial killers like him was still a few decades away. DNA profiling would not become commonplace in police investigations until the 1990s, and extensive use of closed-circuit television cameras was also a couple of decades in the future. But the Robert Zarinsky case proves that with some patience, modern science has the ability to help identify and capture serial killers. Although Zarinsky had been convicted of a number of serious felonies before the late 1960s, murder was not yet a crime on his resume of destruction. In the summer of 1969, 17-year-old Rosemary Calandriello was a girl who was trying to find herself in the ever-changing world of the 60s. Calandriello was known to be a good girl, but like most kids her age, she wanted to fit it. Many of Calandriello's friends liked to drink some beer and smoke marijuana, although finding party favors could sometimes be a problem for the broke, underage high school kids. Enter Robert Zarinsky. Like a true predator, Zarinsky was known to show up at the parties of people 10 years or more younger than him. As a criminal, Zarinsky usually had money, drugs, and a car. He was like the criminal Pied Piper of New Jersey, which turned out to be fatal for Rosemary Calandriello and a number of other girls and young women. August 25, 1969, was the last night anyone saw Rosemary Calandriello, as she seemingly disappeared into thin air, but she was last seen with Robert Zarinsky. "We had 4 eyewitnesses who put the girl in his car," said District Attorney John Mullany. "Then we found the car, and the handles on the doors and the windows were missing." Despite the eyewitnesses' testimonies and the suspicious circumstances of Zarinsky's lost and found car, prosecutors were slow to charge Zarinsky due to a lack of physical evidence and, most importantly, the absence of Calandriello's body. Despite the lack of a body and very little physical evidence, Mullany went ahead with the prosecution, and in 1975 Zarinsky earned the dubious distinction of being the first person convicted of murder in the state of New Jersey without a body. Zarinsky appealed the conviction and lost, but by the late 1980s, perhaps believing that he could obtain parole if he came clean, Zarinsky admitted to murdering Calandriello. In typical sociopathic fashion, he mitigated his responsibility by stating that the murder was accidental. He also vacillated when asked where he disposed of her body. In one interview he said he buried her body in the hills of northwest New Jersey, while in another he claimed to have dumped Calandriello's corpse in the Atlantic Ocean. Although the possibility of parole was conceivable for Zarinsky, the time he spent in prison for Rosemary Calandriello's murder gave science and investigators time to catch up with the serial killer's other crimes. Science identifies a serial killer. The extent of the damage that Robert Zarinsky did to society was not known until fairly recently when scientific advances finally caught up the killer, but the first inkling that he may be a serial killer was revealed because of all things, a family dispute. While Zarinsky was leading his Panthers gang destroying cemeteries and burning down lumber yards, he also took part in his first homicide. In 1958, when Zarinsky was 18, he and his cousin Theodore Schiffer were burglarizing a Pontiac car dealer in Rahway, New Jersey, when they were caught by a police officer. The cop was a veteran named Charles Bernosky who happened to see 2 young men lurking around the parking lot of the Pontiac dealer while he was on patrol. It was a totally random meeting. Unfortunately for Bernosky, the random encounter left him dead on the side of the road. According to witness testimony taken years after the crime, Bernosky surprised the 2 miscreants who then attempted to run. In an era long before police brutality was a common phrase, Bernosky then apparently shot at and hit both fleeing suspects, who then returned fire, killing the officer. He pissed me off, said Zarinsky according to his sister, Judith Sapsa. That's why I shot him. Already seasoned criminals and therefore well aware of what could happen to them if they went to an emergency room, Zarinsky and Schiffer stumbled, bleeding, to Zarinsky's sister Judith Sapsa, who lived nearby. Luckily for the two men, no vital organs were hit, and after Judith and Veronica Zarinsky stitched the two up, they were ready to continue preying on the citizens of New Jersey. But the murder of Charles Bernowski was the first time that science caught up with one of Robert Zarinsky's crimes. In 1999, a fingerprint taken from the crime scene was matched to Schiffer in the Automated Fingerprint Identification System (AFIS). The AFIS database works in much the same way as the CODIS database and essentially served as a template for it. All persons who are fingerprinted for a crime have their prints entered into the AFIS database, which is then used to solve cold cases among other things. It turns out that Schiffer was able to avoid arrest for all of those years, and Zarinsky, perhaps being the more sophisticated criminal, left no fingerprints at the scene. In a strange twist to the crime and an example of the bizarre dynamics of the dysfunctional Zarinsky family, Judith Sapsa implicated her brother as the shooter. It seems that loyalty in the Zarinsky family only went as far as money would take it. While Robert was serving his sentence for the murder of Rosemary Calandriello, he was able to amass a small fortune through some good investments. Apparently Judith had access to the mutual fund, and as her brother sat in prison, she embezzled a good chunk of it. Once Zarinsky learned of his sister's deception, he turned her in and she was promptly arrested for embezzling. She then saw her chance to get even when Schiffer was arrested for Bernowski's murder. The trial of both men turned out to be a lot of finger-pointing with very little physical evidence. Schiffer ended up serving only 3 years for burglary, and in 2001 Zarinsky was acquitted of murder. The jury cited the unreliable testimony of Sapsa and Schiffer as one of their primary reasons, along with a lack of physical evidence. But as DNA testing became more sophisticated and the CODIS database became more complete in the 2000s, the totality of Robert Zarinsky's murder spree was bound to surface with the light of day. Although Zarinsky entered the prison system long before DNA profiling or the CODIS database existed, he, like all long-serving inmates in American prisons, was obliged to give a DNA sample in the 2000s. In the months just before he died in 2008 and in the years since, Zarinsky has been definitively identified through DNA matching as the killer of 2 girls and considered the likely suspect of at least 4 others. After the murder of Charles Bernowski, Zarinsky appears to have gone into a cool-down period. Although it appears that Zarinsky did not plan to murder Bernowski, the act seems to have kindled a dark, murderous desire that was dormant in him. In 1965, Zarinsky acted on that dark impulse when he savagely raped and beat to death 18-year-old Mary Agnes Klinsky near Homedale, New Jersey. After he was done with the young woman, he tossed her on the side of the road like trash, probably because he believed there was no way he could ever be linked to her. In 2016, nearly 8 years after his death, DNA conclusively Zarinsky's next known murder took place when he abducted, raped, and murdered 13-year-old Jane DeRua on November 4, 1968. Apparently, Jane decided to take a shortcut home through a field when she was swooped upon by Zarinsky. Her naked body was found the next day in the field. Semen stains were taken from Darua's clothing, but a mix-up in DNA samples originally led to the arrest of another man. After the problem was discovered and rectified, the sample was then matched to Zarinsky, which led to an indictment on March 11, 2008. Zarinsky died while awaiting trial. Even though Zarinsky is now dead, his DNA profile may still link him to a host of other murders. 17-year-old Linda Balabano was found raped and murdered in 1969, after she disappeared on her way to work in Union County, New Jersey. Then there was the case of 14-year-old Doreen Carlucci and her friend, 15-year-old Joanne Delardo, who were discovered together dead, naked in a field in 1974. The two girls had been raped, beaten, and strangled with an electrical cord. There was also 19-year-old Anne Logan, who was also found raped and beaten to death. The magnitude of Zarinsky's crimes may never be fully known. Although it may be little comfort to the families of Zarinsky's victims, he spent the last years of his life in fear and pain. In 1999, once his initial case became public and it was announced that he was suspected in the murders of other girls and women in New Jersey, he was transferred from general population at the Southwood State Prison to the protected custody block. It seems that the man who could kill girls and women so easily was no match for the hardened convicts in the New Jersey prison system. Finally, on November 28, 2008, after suffering from the painful effects of pulmonary fibrosis for some time, Robert Zarinsky died uneventfully in prison. Although the psychopath took many unanswered questions with him to the grave, DNA profiling in the Cody's database helped prove that he was in fact a serial killer. The finding also helped give closure to some of his victims' families. "We knew he was a serial killer, but there was precious little to prove it," said John Mullany. Eventually, the science caught up and was able to uncover Zarinsky's evil deeds. Chapter 12.